Hey guys! Tonight we're heading back to a place that never built cities with stone walls or towers, yet ruled over more land than any other empire the world had ever seen. But we're not walking into a palace or a battlefield. We're going somewhere softer, quieter. A Mongol clan camp nestled deep on the endless steppe, where the wind doesn't whisper, it watches. It's a world of felt-lined yurts, smoked meat, and rituals that stretch back longer than memory. The fire's barely embers now, and you're waking up inside one of those round homes, still wrapped in scratchy wool, breathing air so cold it tickles your lungs. There's a faint thud of hooves nearby, maybe a goat, maybe a pony, and someone stirring outside, already tending to the hearth. Before we drift too far into the past, if you enjoy these calming sleep stories, maybe gently tap the like button and subscribe, only if it feels right. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's always a small wonder seeing how far these quiet stories can travel across time zones and into bedrooms all over the world. For now, though, let the lights stay low. Maybe switch on a fan or let a soft hum fill the room. This story, like the wind on the Mongol plains, moves slowly. Let it carry you. Outside your yurt, the frost still clings to the grass, turning every blade into a tiny spear of light. The sun hasn't fully climbed above the horizon yet. The camp is only beginning to stir. But already something feels different. Not in the air itself, but in the way people move. A few too many glances exchanged. A woman you've known since childhood clutching her scarf a little tighter around her shoulders. And the silence, that kind of silence that follows bad news. Not loud, not frantic, just heavy, like wool soaked in morning mist. Last night, under the stars, something happened. You weren't there to see it, but you heard the murmurs after. A scandal, they said. Not theft, not drunkenness. Something deeper. Something that makes people lower their voices, not raise them. Among the Mongols living so closely, sleeping beside family, sharing food from the same bowl, shame spreads fast. Not by shouting, but by stillness. And that's what you woke into. A strange, stiff stillness. You pull your boots on, their leather cracked and familiar, and step outside. The wind greets your face like a cold palm. Your breath floats white in the air. Around the fire, a group of elders have already gathered, their backs hunched under thick cloaks. One of them is whispering something low and rhythmic. Maybe a prayer, maybe just an old memory. Beside him, the clan matron stares into the coals like she's reading a story in their glow. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. Her silence says enough. You know what happens next, not the outcome. No one knows that yet. But the rhythm, the slow unfolding of suspicion. Someone has broken a rule, a belief, a line too sacred to cross. Maybe they said the wrong thing at the wrong time. Maybe they acted out of turn in a ritual. Or maybe, just maybe, they were caught doing something far more delicate. Something to do with the old spirits, or the quiet laws no one writes down but everyone remembers. For now, nothing is clear. Only that you are here, on the cold earth of the steppe, in a place where honor rides higher than the wind, and scandal, real or imagined, can travel farther than any horse. The sun had barely pulled itself above the horizon, and yet the camp was already alive with those careful, quiet movements that meant something was wrong. Not wrong in the way a broken yoke or missing goat might be. No, this was the kind of wrong that stirred beneath the surface. You could feel it in the air, heavier than the smoke drifting out of the cook fires. You noticed it in the way people held back their greetings, in how no one sang while milking the mares. Even the dogs were quieter than usual, sticking close to their owners, ears twitching at every shuffle of a boot. Your own stomach was empty, but you felt no urge to eat. That feeling had slipped away with the wind that blew in from the east, carrying with it the stories of things people didn't want to speak of too loudly. Not yet. Someone had been accused, that much you were certain of now. A name hadn't been spoken, not where you could hear it, but all eyes were turning, slowly, toward the edge of the camp, toward the cluster of yurts near the old tamarisk tree. That's where she lived? Erke. You'd known her since you were small. She wasn't important, not in the way elders or warriors were, but people had always listened when she spoke. She had a calm voice, like rippling water, and she brewed the best milk tea anyone could remember. You'd shared it many times, sitting in the warmth of her yurt while the wind howled like wolves outside. Now no one was entering her yurt. No smoke curled from her chimney. That was the first sign. In a Mongol camp, silence isn't an absence, it's a warning. You moved closer, pretending to fetch water, though the bucket in your hand stayed empty. The wind tugged at your cloak, and the grass crackled with frost beneath your feet. You weren't the only one curious. 2 boys, barely old enough to ride, crouched behind a wagon, whispering fiercely to each other. They quieted when they saw you. It wasn't fear, it was something else. That same shared understanding that whatever this was, it had already grown too large to ignore. Someone murmured that Erke had insulted the spirit fire, that she'd allowed her cooking flames to go out during the night without making the proper offering. Others said she had spoken ill of the camp's shaman, that her words had traveled too far and landed in the wrong ears. And one voice, the one you trusted the least, whispered something about forbidden dreams, about a man who visited her yurt when the moon was full and the wind too still. Of course you knew how it worked. No one accused directly. They hinted, they turned their backs, they stopped sharing, and then, if it grew large enough, the elders would gather. They would summon her, not with force, but with silence, the kind that left no room for refusal. By midday, that silence had taken its place like a guest at the fire. Erke stepped out of her yurt, wrapped in a simple robe, her hair undone and loose over her shoulders. No jewelry, no offering bowl in her hands, just her. Her eyes searched the camp, not with fear, but with a tired kind of knowing. She didn't run, she didn't plead, she simply walked, bare feet on cold grass, toward the elders. And as she passed, no one spoke, not even you. You wanted to, but your mouth stayed closed, because here, on this wild, cold plain, words could do many things. But once spoken, they could not be taken back. The grass bent under her steps, brittle with frost, but Erke did not flinch. Her robe was thin, a faded wool wrap you'd seen her wear on market days, and yet she held herself as if cloaked in something finer. The cold must have been biting against her bare feet, but she gave no sign of discomfort. She didn't lower her eyes, she didn't hurry or falter, just that slow, even walk toward the ring of elders who sat with their backs straight and their hands resting on their knees. Around them, the camp seemed to have held its breath. A few people emerged from their yurts only far enough to watch from the shadows. Children peeked between the legs of older siblings. Horses snorted faintly, shifting against their tethers, and even the dogs, usually busy chasing scraps or barking at wind, seemed unnaturally still. Everything waited. The matron rose first. Her face was lined with the wear of many winters, and she wore a thick fur collar around her shoulders, though she rarely needed it. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was low and steady. Not cruel, not yet, just formal. She asked Erke why the spirit fire had died, why the offering stone outside her yurt was cold at sunrise. She did not ask if the rumors were true. That part would come later, but the opening questions were always ceremonial, like knocking on the door of a storm you weren't sure you wanted to open. Erke stood quietly for a moment. She folded her hands, let her eyes drift to the smoke rising from someone else's hearth, then looked back at the circle. Her voice, when it came, was clear but soft, almost too soft for the watching ears that strained toward her. She said the wind had changed direction in the night, that her coals had gone out before she realized, that she had meant no disrespect. She had not failed the fire on purpose. The matron nodded, but there was no approval in it, just acknowledgement. The fire was not the true concern, not really. It was the first stone placed carefully on the path, and everyone knew where that path led. Then came the second voice. Elder, Buktu, whose knees ached so badly he could hardly stand, but whose memory was sharp as obsidian. He asked if she'd seen visions. Had she dreamt of things that did not belong to her? Had she spoken of those dreams? It was this part that turned the wind cold, because dreams, in a clan like this, were sacred. A dream could be a gift or a warning, but to speak of one without a blessing, to claim a vision without the shaman's guidance, that was dangerous. It suggested pride. It suggested ambition. And in a world that depended so deeply on balance and shared survival, ambition was always watched closely. Erke did not deny it. She admitted she'd dreamt of the eagle, not just any eagle, but the one with the white ring around its neck. The one said to carry messages from the upper sky, from Tengri himself. She had dreamt of it circling above the camp. Not once, but 3 nights in a row. And on the 3rd night, she said, it had spoken. A murmur rippled through the crowd, quiet but sharp. You felt it more than heard it, like a shift in the temperature. No one spoke aloud of birds that talked unless they were shamans. No one shared dreams of celestial creatures unless they had been asked to. Erke's calmness now took on another shape, not bravery, not dignity, but something that smelled too close to pride. That was the danger, not what she saw, but how she carried it. The shaman himself had not yet spoken. He sat slightly apart from the elders, a ring of carved stones placed in a crescent around his seat. His eyes were closed, but his fingers moved slowly across the beads at his waist. He wore no headdress today, no bones in his hair, just a plain robe the color of ash. When he finally opened his eyes, the space around him seemed to quiet even further. He asked her if the eagle told her something, and if so, why had she not come to him? Erke looked at him for a long time, and when she answered, her voice did not shake. She said the eagle spoke of a change in the wind, of a clan that would move too soon, of a shadow that would rise from within, not from outside. She said she had stayed quiet because she wasn't sure if it was her place to speak. The shaman's face didn't move, but his fingers stilled. A silence followed that felt longer than it was. You could hear someone cough behind you. A baby cried in the distance, then hushed. The sound of the wind pushing through dry grass filled in the rest. And then the shaman said one word. Dangerous. He didn't say she was lying. He didn't say she was cursed. He simply said the thing everyone else had been thinking. That even if she believed what she said, the choice to keep it, to shape it, to wait, that was what made it dangerous. No one knew what would happen next. Accusations didn't end in one sitting. They ripened, they grew. But now the story had begun to unfold. The woman with the dream, the eagle, the silence, the morning without a flame. These pieces had taken their place, and everyone knew more would follow. You stood very still, unsure of what to feel. You knew Erke. You had sat beside her, eaten her tea eggs, laughed at her jokes about old men losing their teeth. And now she stood across from the elders, accused not of theft or betrayal, but of believing something too deeply and speaking it too quietly. The wind picked up again, and somewhere behind the yurts a horse kicked against its tether. It was going to be a long day. The day crept forward not with urgency, but with the steady rhythm of a slow drum. The sun, though higher now, gave little warmth. It hung pale behind a thin curtain of clouds, casting a washed light over the plains. The kind of light that made colours dull, turned every shadow into a whisper. Fires were lit again in scattered hearths, not for comfort, but for routine. No one spoke of what had happened, not out loud, but the way people moved told its own story. You noticed how bowls of broth were handed more carefully now, how greetings felt shortened, cautious. It wasn't fear exactly, it was the collective pause that comes when a community doesn't know what to believe yet. Everyone had heard Erke's words, everyone had seen her face, and now everyone waited to see what would be done with her, not by force, that wasn't the Mongol way, not usually, but by judgment, slow, layered, unfolding like a story told over several nights beside a low-burning fire. Erke had been told to remain in her yurt until summoned again. She hadn't argued. That alone earned her a thread of respect from some. She bowed to the matron, turned without a word, and walked back across the frost-bitten ground, disappearing behind the flap of her felt door. No guards stood watch, none were needed. The weight of accusation was more binding than rope, and her silence now spoke more loudly than any defense could have. The elders did not meet again that day, not publicly at least. But that didn't stop the conversations. They bloomed in corners, behind drying racks, beside saddle mounds, and felt curtained entries. People spoke in pairs, never groups. Gossip in the steppe had its own etiquette. It didn't roar, it trickled. You heard one woman suggest that Erke's dream was a lie, a ploy to gain importance. Another said she had been cursed long ago, that her mother's line had always been too proud. A third, speaking more softly, wondered if Erke had simply spoken what others had dreamed, but never dared admit aloud. That evening, you found yourself outside her yurt, not by plan, but by the slow drift of your feet. You paused, unsure. The curtain hung still. No light flickered from within. Then, just as you were about to turn away, a voice called softly from inside. "I have goat milk left. It's sour, but not too much." It wasn't an invitation exactly, but neither was it a refusal. You hesitated, then ducked inside. The warmth hit you first, thick and smoky, clinging to your clothes. Her fire had been relit. A small coal bed glowed in the iron basin, and beside it the faint outline of a kettle. She was seated, cross-legged on a mat, a woven shawl draped over her shoulders. She poured the milk into a chipped wooden cup and handed it to you without looking directly. You sipped, slowly. It was, as she said, just beginning to sour, but warm. "Do you believe I lied?" she asked after a long pause. The question wasn't sharp. It wasn't even accusatory. It was like tossing a feather into still water just to see if the ripples would come. You thought for a moment, then told her the truth, or what little of it you could find. You said you believed she had dreamed. That was clear in her voice when she spoke of it. But whether it had meaning, or whether the meaning belonged to her, you didn't know. She smiled faintly. "That's fair," she said. "That's more than most will give me." Outside, the wind picked up again, tugging at the edges of the yurt. Somewhere not far, you heard the bells of a goat moving restlessly in its pen. Erke stirred the fire, the iron poker scraping lightly against the embers. "They think I want something," she said. "Power, position. But all I want is to speak plainly, without punishment. Is that so much?" You didn't answer. You didn't need to. The truth was too large to fit in the tiny space between two people sipping sour milk. When you left, the sky was full of low stars just starting to appear. The camp had settled into evening routines. Dogs circled before lying down. Children were being pulled indoors. The smoke curled upward in soft, silver streams. And somewhere behind it all, in the quiet center of the camp, sat a woman who had dared to dream out loud. In a world that respected dreams but feared who claimed them, that was both bravery and danger. The elders would decide soon, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. The next morning arrived not with drama but with fog. A soft grey veil had rolled across the plains overnight, muting everything in its path. It covered the camp like a thin skin, settling over the yurts and grazing animals, over the ropes and cooking stones, until even the horizon disappeared into pale nothingness. It was the kind of weather that made people stay quiet longer than usual, that turned even loud voices into whispers by default. You stepped out of your yurt and the world felt muffled, as if the steppe itself had lowered its voice to listen. No decisions had been made yet about Erke. That much you knew. If something had happened during the night, it hadn't been shared. But something was beginning to stir. Not just among the elders who would take their time and weigh every word, but in the hearts of those who had listened too closely to the wind. Some had started saying the fog itself was a sign that the eagle she'd dreamed of had spread its wings and flown above the camp while they slept, covering the earth in its shadow. Superstition had a way of growing roots when the ground was soft, and this fog had made everything soft, uncertain. You noticed more people avoiding her yurt now, giving it a wider berth than necessary. A boy tossed a bone for his dog, and when it rolled near her door, he chose to whistle the animal back rather than fetch it. Even kindness had grown cautious. Later that morning, you joined the others near the fire ring where two elders sat sharpening knives, not for threat, but for butchering the sheep that would be shared at week's end. It was routine, this task, something done without thought. But today, the blades seemed to scrape louder against the whetstones. The conversation swirled low and slow, like smoke trying to find a way out of a closed yurt. One man said Erke had crossed a line, that dreams were meant for interpretation, not ownership. That a woman speaking them as if they were hers alone was unsettling. Another said it was not the dream itself, but her calmness that unsettled people. That if she had wept, if she had begged forgiveness, if she had denied it outright, the storm might have passed. But her stillness had left them with no safe direction to turn. That afternoon, the shaman emerged from his yurt for the first time since the gathering. He moved slowly, not from age, but from habit. His steps were always deliberate. He passed no judgment with his gaze. He simply walked the perimeter of the camp, pausing at key spots, the prayer stone, the water basin, the entrance to the horse enclosure. When he reached Erke's yurt, he didn't enter. He only placed a small bundle of dried herbs on the ground beside her door, bound with red thread. A signal, and not a gentle one. Her door stayed closed. The meaning was clear. The herbs were for purification, yes, but also protection or warning. Sometimes those things blurred together. That night, you dreamt of a hawk, not an eagle, but something smaller, sharper. It circled low over the grass, its wings brushing against tall stalks, and when it landed, it spoke not with words, but with a sound like fire crackling. You woke with the taste of smoke in your mouth and the lingering sense that you'd heard something important, though the meaning slipped away before your eyes even opened fully. The next morning, Erke was seen at the well, alone. She had filled 2 buckets and carried them herself, one on each shoulder, a task usually shared. A small line of children watched her from behind a cart. None spoke. She didn't speak to them either. You noticed then something you hadn't before. Her eyes looked tired, yes, but not frightened. If anything, there was a quiet resolve settling into her bones, like someone who had accepted the weight of their truth, even if it bent their spine. The camp had not yet decided her fate, but Erke had clearly already made her own peace. Whether with guilt, innocence, or something more complicated, no one could say. Even the goats, it seemed, walked a little more carefully now. The fog didn't lift the next day. If anything, it thickened, clinging tighter to the hills and softening the sound of hoofbeats until even the horses seemed ghost-like. Smoke from the morning fires rose just a few feet before curling sideways and vanishing. It made the camp feel smaller somehow, as if the world beyond the tents had shrunk overnight, leaving only this circle of tension where nothing moved too fast and no one spoke too loud. You stirred your breakfast slowly, the warm millet gruel steaming in your bowl. The taste was familiar, but it didn't bring comfort the way it usually did. Not today. News came in fragments. Someone said a rider had gone out early, sent by the elders toward a neighboring camp. They didn't say why, they never did, not openly. But a messenger usually meant one of 2 things. The elders were seeking advice, or they were preparing to send someone away. And the fact that no one would say which only deepened the silence. You saw Erke again that morning, this time kneeling beside the bones of a small fire outside her yurt. She was spreading ashes with her fingers, slowly, drawing wide circles as if searching for a pattern only she could see. Her sleeves were rolled back, revealing forearms marked faintly by soot and old sun. It was a quiet act, almost meditative, yet strange enough to draw glances. Someone muttered that she was trying to read omens from the fire's remains. That such things were the shaman's work, not hers. You weren't sure if she heard, but if she did, she gave no sign. What you did notice was the absence. People were no longer coming near. Not out of malice, not directly, but out of uncertainty. It was easier to look past her now, to act as if her presence were some passing fog to wait out. She had become a sort of still stone in the stream, part of the landscape, but something the water naturally avoided. Later that day, a small council formed. Not the full gathering, not yet, but the shape of one. 3 elders seated beneath the central canopy, speaking in slow turns with bowls of steaming broth between them. The shaman stood nearby, though he said little. His presence alone carried weight. And beside him, unexpectedly, was the camp's horsemaster, a man not usually involved in judgments of this kind. That meant something too. Horses were tied to movement, to exile, to travel. His presence was a quiet signal. Whatever decision was being formed, it would soon involve motion. You sat with the others, listening from a respectful distance, as was custom. No one could hear every word, but some things didn't need to be said loudly to be understood. The elders were weighing risk. Not just the truth or falsehood of Erke's dream, but the danger it had stirred in people's minds. Dreams were sacred in the steppe life, yes, but they were also unpredictable. They didn't live quietly. And a dream that lingered, that moved from one mouth to another, could shift a clan's direction faster than any storm. That was the fear, spoken or not. By evening, the camp settled into uneasy routine. Fires were lit, bread was baked on stones, goats were herded closer to the center, their bells making dull, uncertain music in the mist. You noticed people glancing toward Erke's yurt less often now, not because they had forgotten, but because they had accepted something. A decision was forming. Maybe it hadn't yet been spoken, but it was already being lived. That night, as the fog thickened once more, a crow landed on the frame of Erke's yurt. It cawed only once, sharp and sudden, before flying off into the grey. It was a small thing, maybe, a bird, nothing more, but in a camp full of quiet tension, even small things gained shape. By morning, someone would surely call it a sign, and maybe they'd be right. That night, after the crow's cry faded into the wet silence, sleep came to the camp in fits and starts. You found yourself drifting in and out of shallow dreams, each one too murky to remember clearly, but leaving behind fragments of feeling. A pale river, a hand reaching through smoke, a voice you couldn't understand speaking from behind a curtain. You woke before dawn to the faint sound of hooves crunching across frost. Not fast, not hurried, just deliberate. Someone was preparing to ride again, and this time the sound didn't pass by. It stopped outside the elders' circle. You stayed beneath your blanket for a while longer, not from cold, but because the world outside had begun to feel too uncertain for comfort. When you finally stepped out, the fog had lessened, but not lifted. It still hovered low to the ground, pooling in dips and gullies, blurring the distance into something that felt less like landscape and more like memory. The camp was beginning to stir. A few fires had been lit, their smoke rising more confidently now, curling upward in search of wind. The goats were already bleating, and someone was calling softly for their children to fetch water. But the usual rhythm, the hum of daily tasks and morning greetings, still stumbled beneath the weight of what had not yet been said. Erke's yurt stood unchanged, the flap drawn shut, the thread-bound herbs still resting like a sentry beside the doorway. No one had touched them. No one would. That red thread meant something, even to those who claimed they didn't believe in signs. You passed by slowly, not close enough to be noticed, but near enough to catch the faint scent of burnt wool and dried milk lingering in the air. Her fire had not been lit again. That, too, was a message. By midday, the elders gathered fully. This time it was official. The mats were laid in a tight circle, the ceremonial bowl of salt placed at the center, untouched. The sky above remained pale, the kind of colorless ceiling that made even voices sound flatter. You joined the others as they formed an outer ring, standing far enough to keep the elders' space sacred, but close enough to listen. The air was thick, not with tension exactly, but with expectation. Everyone knew the story had reached its edge. Now it would either break apart or be bound back together one way or another. The matron spoke first, her voice strong despite her age. She acknowledged Erke's place in the camp, her years of quiet labor, her contributions in festivals, and her care for the sick during the last harsh winter. Then she shifted. She spoke of the fire that had gone out, not just in her hearth, but in the trust between people. That's how they framed it. Not as accusation, but as disruption. Not that she had lied or betrayed, but that she had unsettled. It was a word they returned to again and again. Unsettled. The shaman, still seated slightly apart, spoke only once. He said the eagle was not hers to call, that visions must come through channels rooted in tradition. That power was not just in seeing, but in knowing where to carry what had been seen, and that her silence afterward was what changed the shape of the vision from wisdom to danger. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Then finally, Erke was called to speak. She emerged slowly from her yurt, her posture still unbowed. Her robe was the same faded one she'd worn the day of her first questioning. No adornments, no signs of penance or defiance. Just a woman standing in the middle of her own storm. She walked to the edge of the circle and stopped, not crossing the line of respect marked by the salt bowl. Her voice was soft when she spoke, but steady. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't deny her dream. Instead, she spoke of the eagle again, this time with more detail. She described its wings wide enough to block the sun, its cry not loud but endless, and the way it circled not just above her but above all of them. She said the dream was not hers to keep, but it had come to her, and that refusing to share it would have been the true betrayal. When she finished, no one clapped, no one nodded. The wind stirred slightly, and the sound of a tethered horse snorting in the distance filled the pause. The matron stood once more and declared the council would rest in silence and reconvene at sunset. Until then, no one was to speak of the dream aloud. The hours that followed were long and restless. People worked their tasks more quickly, as if rushing through the day might change its outcome. Children were hushed more often than necessary. Meals were eaten quietly, some even outside, away from the hearths. You found yourself wandering toward the ridge, overlooking the shallow stream just outside camp. The fog there was thinner, and the breeze stronger. It felt easier to think where the wind could move freely. You sat with your thoughts, wondering whether dreams could truly do harm, or if it was the fear they stirred that gave them weight. As the sun began its slow descent, the light turned amber across the hills, casting long shadows. Behind you, the elders would be gathering, again soon. And when they did, the camp would change. Whether by exile, forgiveness, or something more complicated, the story would take a new turn. You stayed seated a little longer, watching the stream shimmer. The wind carried the faint sound of a drum warming by the fire, a signal that the time had come. By the time you returned from the ridge, the camp had already begun to shift its shape again. Fires were being stirred into fuller flame, and the light had changed from silver grey to the rich, golden hue that only came in the last hour before dusk. It painted the tops of the yurts with a warm glow, but even that didn't soften the mood. There was no laughter drifting from doorways, no cheerful clanging of bowls or idle singing. The silence had returned, more pronounced now, more settled, like everyone was waiting to see something fall into place. You moved toward the elders' circle, though not too close. People had gathered again, forming that quiet ring around the core. Erke was already seated, not standing this time, but kneeling on a low mat, her hands resting in her lap. She looked neither defiant nor defeated. If anything, her expression held that same weary steadiness she'd shown since the beginning. The kind that doesn't come from certainty, but from living through too many quiet storms to fear the next one fully. The matron spoke with little ceremony. This was no longer about accusation, but consequence. The council had decided, she said, that Erke would be given space, not cast out entirely, but asked to relocate her yurt to the outer edge of the camp for a season, 3 moons to be precise. She would not be banned from water, food, or fire, but she would no longer sit among the central hearths. Nor would she be consulted in decisions or dreams. It was not exile, it was separation. A drawing of breath between what had been and what might come next. The phrasing was careful, respectful even, but everyone understood the message. Erke was being made smaller for a time, her voice muted, her presence set apart. Not erased, but no longer included in the way it had been. Some would say it was mercy, others that it was shame. Erke nodded once. She didn't argue. She didn't speak. She simply bowed her head, low and slow, until her forehead touched the woven mat. A gesture of acceptance, or perhaps just exhaustion. She remained bowed as the elders stood and slowly dispersed, each returning to their own fires and responsibilities. You watched her stay there, still as a stone, long after the last mat had been rolled and the salt bowl returned to its pouch. As darkness came, people moved quietly around her. A few cast glances, a few others averted their eyes entirely. No one approached. You felt a tightness in your chest, the kind that came not from anger or sadness, but from helplessness. A heaviness born of knowing that truth and community didn't always walk side by side. Later you saw her begin the slow task of moving, not that evening, not yet, but the gathering of things had started. She unhooked the leather straps that fastened her yurt's doorway, set aside the small clay jars where she kept dried herbs. She folded her sleeping mat with care, smoothing each crease as if reminding it of gentler times. You wanted to offer help, but something held you back. Maybe it was the look on her face, or maybe it was the unspoken rule that this part, at least, must be done alone. Night deepened around the camp. A few voices rose in quiet song, old lullabies that traveled softly from mother to child. A dog barked once and was hushed. Somewhere far off, a horse neighed in its sleep. Life continued, because it always did. But around Erke's space the air felt thinner, as if the wind itself hesitated before passing through. You lay awake longer than usual that night, staring at the fabric of your yurt above you, tracing patterns in the seams where smoke had darkened the wool. Your thoughts drifted not only to Erke, but to the others in camp, those who had stayed silent, those who had whispered, those who had watched. All of them part of the same story now, whether they knew it or not. Dreams were sacred, yes, but people were fragile, and in between the two was always that narrow space where misunderstanding grew. As you finally drifted into sleep, the last thing you saw was the faint glow of Erke's fire, now lit again, flickering softly on the edge of camp. A small circle of warmth against the cold stretch of night. The morning after the council's decision unfolded with a stillness that felt different than before. It was not the watchful hush of uncertainty, but the kind that follows after something final has been said. The kind of quiet that doesn't ask questions anymore. When you stepped out of your yurt, the fog had retreated almost entirely. What remained was a faint dampness on the grass, dew clinging to the edges of wool blankets hung to air out, and the scent of ash lingering in the windless morning air. The camp stretched out clearly now, each yurt and enclosure visible in crisp detail beneath the soft light of dawn. You looked toward the outer edge, where Erke's new place had taken form. It was a modest patch, away from the main ring of yurts, but still within the camp's reach. Not exile, no, but unmistakably apart. She had rebuilt quickly, her yurt already pitched its walls, standing steady against the breeze. You could see her crouched outside, tending to a kettle, steam rising in thin tendrils as she coaxed a flame beneath it. She moved with the same calm precision she always had, her gestures unhurried, her shoulders set. But there was something smaller in the way she sat, a fold in her spine that hadn't been there before. Most people avoided looking directly at her now. They had accepted the decision, placed it like a stone in the circle of their minds, and moved on. But not entirely. Not deep down. You could tell by the way they paused when they walked near, the way their conversations thinned when her name came close to being spoken. Her presence was a knot that hadn't yet untangled, and no one wanted to be the one to pull the thread. You busied yourself with tasks that day, sharpening tools, helping mend a broken fence post near the goat pen, but your eyes kept drifting back to that quiet edge of the camp. Erke remained mostly in place, only leaving her yurt briefly to gather water and herbs, then returning with the same unbroken rhythm. She did not wander, she did not linger near others. She kept her distance, not out of fear, but as if she understood this part of the ritual required solitude, or perhaps she preferred it now. That afternoon, the sky darkened unexpectedly. A wide band of clouds swept in from the west, storm-heavy, but thick enough to cast a pale gloom across the steppe. The change in light was subtle, but enough to stir unease. People began to glance upward more often, gauging the shape of the sky, the weight of the air. Weather meant something here, not just in the way it shaped the day's work, but in the way it was read, interpreted. And today, the sky seemed to be echoing something unspoken. It was late in the day when the first visitor came to Erke's yurt. A girl, not yet 10, with a braid so long it touched her belt, carrying a folded cloth bundle in both hands. She walked with the kind of boldness only children seem to have, the kind that hasn't yet been taught to shrink from what others fear. She knelt beside Erke's doorway, placed the bundle down, then walked away without waiting to be acknowledged. You were close enough to see Erke step out a moment later, unwrap the bundle, and hold up a pair of worn woolen socks. Nothing grand, just warmth, something given. She stood with them for a moment, looking after the girl, then brought them inside, no smile, no words, just the quiet folding of gesture into memory. That small act seemed to loosen something. The next day, a boy left a pouch of dried berries by her door. Later, an elder woman paused long enough near her fire to nod. Only that. But it was more than before. The boundary around Erke's exile was beginning to bend, not break, but shift. Still, not everyone was pleased. You overheard one of the horse tenders muttering that the kindnesses were dangerous, that they blurred the lines drawn by the council, that dreams once spoken couldn't be buried with berries and socks. His voice was tight with frustration, not anger, as if he believed the camp needed the separation to mean something. That if Erke was let back in too easily, it would weaken the order of things, the rules of balance. But the steppe didn't always care for rules. It changed with the wind, and sometimes so did hearts. That evening, you passed near her yurt again. She was sitting outside, staring across the plain where the sky was clearing just enough to show the first faint stars. You caught her glance, and this time she didn't look away. Her voice was soft when she spoke, so soft you almost missed it. "They don't know what they're forgiving," she said, "and I'm not sure I know either." You didn't reply. Instead, you sat beside her for a while, watching the stars appear one by one, the cold returning to the air like a slow tide. Sometimes silence was its own kind of trust. The stars deepened into the night sky like scattered embers across black felt, and you stayed beside Erke longer than you had planned to. No words passed between you after that first quiet confession, but it didn't feel like silence in the hollow way silence sometimes sits. This was the kind that filled in around the edges of shared space, comforting like a heavy blanket. From the main camp, a few voices still murmured low behind closed yurt flaps. The wind had calmed to nothing, the air unmoving. It was that rare moment in the steppe when everything became so still you could hear the crack of wood shrinking in the cold or the twitch of a horse's ears half a field away. Eventually, Erke stood and returned to her yurt. She didn't invite you inside, and you didn't expect her to. She paused once, one hand resting against the doorframe, and glanced back at the stars. Then she disappeared within. You made your way back to your own fire, the path clear, but the night around you seemed larger than before, like the sky had pulled up its edges and made the world just a little more endless. In the days that followed, a small place at the edge of the camp became a quiet rhythm in itself. She didn't return to her place in the communal line for water, choosing instead to draw from the far well near the willow. Her fire remained steady, the smoke always rising in a clean ribbon each morning, and each evening she lit a single oil lamp outside her doorway. Not a signal, not a call, just a small, steady glow, a way of saying, "I am here." It became a part of the camp's new shape, that lamp, like the soft ring of bells on a tethered goat or the flap of cloth drying in the breeze. It did not beg attention, but it refused to vanish. The gifts continued, though more slowly now. A bundle of kindling, a small pouch of salt, things not spoken of, just left near her door before first light, or as dusk folded itself down again. No one claimed credit. That was part of the understanding. You did not offer openly, and she did not thank openly. But both parties knew the gesture was not just about survival, it was about remembering. And then something else shifted. One afternoon, when the sky was unusually clear and the wind had returned from the west with the scent of melting ice and distant grass, a traveller arrived. A man, older than most riders you'd seen, his face shaped by sun and time, wearing a travel-stained cloak the colour of tree bark. He came not in a group, but alone, riding a patient mare with a dust-caked mane. He spoke briefly with the guards at the camp's edge, showed no emblem, no token, just a carved bone at his belt, shaped like a feather with lines etched deep into the grain. A mark that some recognized and others didn't. He was taken directly to the elders. You watched from a distance as they received him with more curiosity than formality. He sat low among them, his voice barely reaching your ears, though you caught fragments, names, places, a mention of birds. Then, unexpectedly, a pause, followed by a turn of the head. He asked for Erke. You saw the shaman's posture shift, not in protest but in tension, a stiffening like the air before lightning strikes, even without a cloud in the sky. A messenger was sent to her. She didn't ask questions, just followed with quiet steps, her shawl drawn close against her shoulders. The traveller stood when she approached, not out of politeness, but respect. She did not bow, neither did he. They looked at each other as if both recognized something faint and distant in the other, like an echo across hills. He asked her about the eagle. She didn't hesitate. She told the dream again, this time with greater clarity than before, as if the weeks of repetition had smoothed the edges of the memory into something both real and ritual. The fire, the wings, the circle over the camp, the silence that followed its cry. When she finished, the traveller sat back, eyes closed, for a long while. Then he said softly, "That dream has travelled farther than you know." There was no pronouncement, no decision, just that sentence. And then, slowly, the visitor stood, turned to the elders, and said he would remain for one more night before continuing east. The camp buzzed quietly that evening. No one dared call it a change, but it felt like something had opened. A crack in the wall that had grown between Erke and the rest. A faint wind had begun to pass through. And her lamp burned brighter that night, its flame unshaken by the wind. The night the traveller stayed was one of those peculiar evenings when the air felt both close and hollow. A strange tension, like the land itself was holding a breath it didn't quite know how to release. The stars blinked clear above, but there was no wind, no sound of shifting branches or distant animals. only the slow popping of fires and the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the drop in temperature. The camp did not sleep easily. You sensed it in the way people lingered by their hearths, how laughter died before it fully left a mouth. Everyone, it seemed, was waiting for something, even if they didn't know what it was. The traveller did not speak again that night, at least not where others could hear. He remained in the elders' circle for a time after dusk, sharing food and small talk, nothing that carried weight. But his presence had already done its work. Word had spread quietly and without exaggeration that someone from beyond had heard of Erke's dream before setting foot in the camp, that the vision she had carried alone was not about secret as it had once seemed. This did not change opinions instantly. Years of belief do not vanish with one stranger's nod, but it disturbed the settled dust in people's minds, stirred something uncertain that had long lain still. Erke, for her part, returned to her yurt with no ceremony. She lit her lamp, she made her tea. If the conversation with the traveller had affected her, she didn't show it. And perhaps that was her way of keeping control, of ensuring no one else could shape the story she was still living. You saw her briefly in passing, her silhouette lit from within her tent as she moved slowly around the low fire. A shadow of daily life against woolen walls, ordinary and yet not. The next morning brought a change in the light. Not a dramatic one, but the kind that makes shadows stretch a little farther, that gives the sky a cleaner edge. It smelled faintly of thawing ice and early blossoms, though no flower had yet dared show itself. The traveller prepared to leave just after sunrise. His horse was ready, saddled without fuss, his belongings wrapped in neat bundles. A few elders approached to offer thanks, but there were no lengthy farewells. He simply mounted, turned toward the open plain, and before he moved on, he looked once more toward Erke's yurt. She stepped outside at that moment, as if she'd sensed the turn of his head. She did not wave, neither did he. But they nodded to each other, a single small motion that said more than anything spoken might have. Then he rode away, becoming smaller with each rise of earth, until he was only a movement in the heatless light. And then, not even that. After his departure, the camp resumed its routine, but with a loosened stiffness. Children played a little farther from their homes, chasing each other past the borders they'd recently respected. 2 women passed by Erke's fire without turning away. One even dropped a few dried apple slices into a bowl near the hearth, murmuring something about leftover trade goods. These were not grand gestures, not apologies, but in a world held together by custom and gesture, even small things spoke loudly. You caught a glimpse of the shaman that afternoon, standing atop the low ridge near the northern edge of the camp. He was alone, his staff planted beside him, watching the sky. His robes rippled slightly in the breeze that had begun to return. He stayed there for a long while, unmoving. Then, just before he turned away, he raised his hand, not to the sky, but to something only he could see or feel. A response, maybe, or a signal. You couldn't know. By sunset, Erke's place no longer felt like the exile it had been. People still gave her space, but not out of punishment, more out of reverence or maybe confusion. As if they were unsure whether she now stood closer to the sacred or the strange. And Erke herself moved through it all with that same quiet poise. No declarations, no demands, just a steady presence that was becoming harder to ignore, even for those who wanted to. That night, the stars burned brighter than they had in weeks, and near the fire, someone hummed a tune you hadn't heard since winter began, a lullaby older than the oldest elder, telling of a dream that crossed 1,000 hills before finding a voice. And though no one said her name, you felt it ripple beneath the sound. Morning drifted over the camp in a slow golden hush. The kind of light that came without sharpness, where the sun gently unfolded itself across the earth like a sleeping cat stretching its limbs. Smoke rose early from the hearths that day, but it moved higher than before, curling up and catching sunlight as it lifted. You could feel the subtle shift in mood, the weight that had settled over the camp in the days following Erke's first questioning seemed to be thinning, like a heavy robe, slowly slipping from shoulders too tired to carry it any longer. Life had returned to a quieter rhythm, one not dictated by unease or careful silences. Children's laughter rose more freely again, mingling with the bleats of goats and the calls of herders, preparing for short journeys to the stream. Even the elders, once solemn and close-mouthed, seemed more at ease. You saw them speaking with relaxed posture, their faces no longer held in tight lines of deliberation. The storm had not passed entirely, but it had softened into drizzle. Erke remained on the edge, her yurt still pitched in its solitary place just beyond the main circle, but something had changed there too. It no longer looked like an island cut off from the rest. Rather, it had become a place some eyes turned to with a kind of gentle curiosity. A few younger women, those who once walked past briskly with eyes averted, now let their gaze linger a little longer. One even stopped to ask if she needed help fetching water. Erke had declined, but with a soft smile, the kind that tucked itself into the corners of her mouth without reaching her eyes. You spent part of that morning tending to leather repairs near the horse line. The breeze was picking up, tugging at the corners of blankets hung to dry, stirring dust that had been sleeping in the cracks of the earth. There was talk among some of a caravan coming through in the next week, traders from the southern valleys who brought cloth and salt, along with news from cities carved into stone. It would bring more than goods. It would bring new ears to the story of the dream, new mouths to retell it in ways the camp hadn't imagined yet. Erke's story was no longer confined to the circle of elders. That much was certain. The traveller's arrival had broken the walls around it, and now it moved like a river finding tributaries. It flowed in and out of people's thoughts, reshaping their questions, loosening the certainty they once clung to. You heard a boy ask his grandmother what would happen if the eagle returned in a dream to someone else. Would that person also be asked to move their yurt? Yes, grandmother had no answer. She only shook her head slowly and rubbed a charm between her fingers. That afternoon, Erke stepped into the main camp for the first time in days. She came without announcement, carrying a wrapped bundle in both arms, flatbread, still warm, and a clay jar of pickled radish slices. She walked to the cooking hearth where several women prepared supper and placed the food beside the others. She said nothing, didn't wait for thanks, just nodded, turned, and returned to her yurt. It was such a small act, and yet it rippled wider than the bread itself, because no one had asked her. No one had told her she could return. She had simply done it, in the quiet, confident way she always did. And the women, well, they didn't stop her. They didn't turn away. One even placed the jar carefully among the others with a kind of gentleness usually reserved for new gifts. That night, the oil lamp outside Erke's yurt was joined by a second flame. A small visitor had placed a tallow candle beside it, squat and flickering wildly in the wind. It didn't last long. The breeze caught it and snuffed it out. But the gesture remained. Someone had thought to add light to hers, and that mattered. You found yourself walking past her place again before sleep. Not to visit, not even to speak, just to pass by. She was inside, you could tell from the thin glow behind the felt walls. The camp was still, but it no longer felt like it was waiting for a verdict. It was breathing again, slowly but surely. And you wondered, as you pulled your blanket higher that night, if dreams really did belong to the dreamer. Or if, once shared, they became the shape of a news story the whole camp was bound to follow, whether it wanted to or not. By the 13th day, after the council's decision, Erke's name was no longer spoken in hushed tones. It was not shouted, no, and no songs had been written of her vision, but it had begun to take its place in daily conversation in the same way the weather or the behavior of the goats might. That was a kind of power in itself. When a story moved from being something feared to something woven into the small exchanges of everyday life, it gained permanence. It rooted itself not in ceremony, but in repetition, in the telling and retelling. That morning, as you tied a bundle of kindling and listened to the wind worry the canvas flaps of nearby yurts, you heard an elder explain Erke's dream again to a group of boys half dozing beside their lessons. He didn't embellish, he didn't whisper. He told it simply, as if it had always belonged to the camp's memory. And the boys didn't seem startled or unsettled. They just nodded, accepting it as part of the world they were being shaped to inherit. Later, you saw two women pause by Erke's yurt, not to speak, but to listen. She was singing, not loudly, not with performance, but the kind of low, rhythmic singing meant to keep one company while grinding grain or patching seams. A tune with no beginning and no end, carried out on a single breath and folded into itself again and again. It was a song you had heard your grandmother hum once during a storm. It had no known name, but everyone recognized it. A song used for waiting. The sound of it floated through the air gently, brushing against wool and smoke and the scrape of hooves nearby. It lingered with you long after you walked away. By midday, the weather had shifted again. The sun broke through with more strength, drying patches of ground that had been soft with dew for days. That change, too, was noticed. You heard someone murmur that the earth was finally accepting warmth again, that maybe the frost had finished speaking for now. These small interpretations of nature were part of life on the steppe. They guided the unseen decisions behind when to mend saddles, when to move herds, and, whether anyone would say it aloud, when to open a door again to someone once shut out. In the afternoon, an old woman named Boka, rarely seen outside her tent except during festivals, visited Erke. She brought with her a bundle of dried lavender and the reed flute she used only during healing rituals. No one knew exactly what passed between them in that yurt, but the scent of lavender lingered heavily in the air afterward, clinging sweetly to the breeze like something sacred. That night, someone placed a carved feather on a small stone beside Erke's yurt. Not the feather of a real bird, but one etched into wood and worn, smooth by years of handling. A gift, surely, though no one claimed it. The camp was changing, and it was doing so softly, without announcements or decisions. The change was in the way the smoke from Erke's fire no longer drew glances, in the way children no longer had to be reminded to keep their distance. In the way her name was no longer a cause for tension, but part of a larger conversation. You found yourself wondering if this was what healing looked like in places like this. Not dramatic, not fast, not even entirely intentional, but slow, like thawing earth, like the quiet return of grass after a long snow. One step, one gesture, one unspoken forgiveness at a time. That evening, Erke's lamp burned again, but this time it flickered alongside another. A neighbor had lit theirs earlier than usual, and for the first time since her exile, light came from more than one yurt near the edge of the camp. The darkness didn't retreat, but it softened. And as you closed your eyes that night, you thought again of the eagle from her dream, not circling above as a warning, but perhaps gliding silently over the camp, wings wide, casting no shadow. The days that followed moved with a kind of measured gentleness, like water flowing around smooth stones. There was no announcement, no declaration from the elders, and yet Erke's exile had begun to blur at the edges. People no longer kept count of how many days had passed since the council's verdict. Instead, they counted how many bowls she had left at communal fires, how many times she had been seen sitting among the drying racks near the clothmakers, nodding quietly to passers-by. It was subtle, this return, not an entrance, not a welcome, but a presence slowly allowed to expand. By now, her yurt no longer seemed an island. Its perimeter had been softened by footpaths, by small items that found their way to her space and never returned. A wooden ladle, a clay dish, a spool of dyed thread she had likely borrowed or been given, and had kept with the quiet grace of someone who knows not to ask too many questions. You walked by her place often, and more than once you found yourself lingering just a little longer, letting your steps slow as though some part of you was listening, even when no words were being spoken. It was on one such afternoon that something unexpected happened. A young girl, no older than 8, was seen outside Erke's yurt carrying a small, fur-wrapped pouch. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of whatever task she had taken on. She stepped up to the fire pit, now blackened with repeated use, and placed the pouch near the stones. Then she turned and ran, not from shame or scolding, but with the shy urgency of someone completing a ritual they didn't yet fully understand. Erke stepped outside soon after. She knelt beside the pouch, untied the knotted string with deliberate fingers, and pulled from it a handful of carved pebbles, each one worn smooth and etched with symbols of luck and protection. The kind of talismans grandparents pass to grandchildren, meant to be kept in pockets or sewn into sleeves. She didn't look around, didn't ask who had sent them. She simply placed them, one by one, in a circle around the firestones, her hands moving like they remembered an old pattern. Later that evening, as the sun set and the hills grew blue with shadow, the shaman walked past her yurt. He did not stop. He did not speak. But he paused long enough to adjust the reeds at the edge of the fire pit, turning them just slightly, as if aligning them with some unseen energy. It was a gesture without words, but not without meaning. The elders had not reversed their verdict, but it was becoming clear that the story was no longer just theirs to shape. Inside your own yurt that night, the fire crackled as you pressed your feet close for warmth. Outside, the wind had picked up again, carrying the scent of dry grass and something faintly sweet. Lavender, perhaps, still lingering from Boka's visit days before. The sound of the wind was comforting in its way, not fierce, just constant, like a voice that refused to stop humming. You had thought of Erke's dream, how it had once divided the camp like a sharp blade, and how now it was being softened, retold not as a warning, but as a story people were learning to carry without fear. Somewhere near the goat pens, someone was laughing, not loudly but freely, a sign maybe that the tightness had left people's chests, if only a little. And as your eyes closed, heavy with sleep and the weight of the day, you remembered the way Erke had placed those stones, carefully, reverently. As if she believed, despite everything, that even the smallest things, when placed with intention, could shift the shape of the world. The first soft green of early growth began to touch the edges of the camp not long after the placing of the carved stones. It wasn't a full change, not yet, but it was the kind of shift you could feel before you saw. a change in the way the earth pressed back beneath your feet, firmer now, with a faint resistance. The way the wind carried not just cold, but a promise, like it had passed over something blooming and brought a breath of it with each gust. Even the animals moved differently, more restless, more expectant, as if they too were aware that the steppe was waking up. With the change in season came the time for mending and preparing. Yurt walls were brushed and patched, and tools that had sat unused during the colder weeks were brought out, their metal parts rubbed clean with cloth soaked in sheep fat. Children were given small tasks again, tying knots, gathering pebbles, cleaning dry dung for fire fuel, and in their laughter and squabbling, you heard the old rhythm return. Erke, too, began to move differently. She still lived on the edge, her yurt positioned just beyond the main cluster, but the space between her and the rest had narrowed in meaning if not in distance. She was no longer a shadow. People spoke to her again, not with formality, but in the everyday way that gave the camp its warmth. Could she lend her bone needle? Had she extra dried onions from last season's store? Would she mind watching a sleeping child while a mother fetched milk? Each small request was a thread rewoven into the fabric of belonging, and Erke met each one with her usual quiet steadiness. One afternoon, as the sun tilted low and spread amber light across the hills, you saw her walking with Boka again. The old woman's reed flute was tucked into her sash, and a satchel of crushed herbs swung gently from one wrist. They didn't speak much as they walked, but something about the way they moved, side by side, their steps slow and matching, spoke of a comfort not easily formed. They stopped near the eastern boundary of the camp, where a patch of rocky soil had begun to thaw. There, together, they knelt and worked the earth with their hands, pulling away dead grass and pressing dried seeds into the soil. Not for crops, not here, but for flowers. Wild ones, bright, ragged things that grew only if left mostly alone. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Planting flowers near a yurt, even so far at the edge, was a way of saying, "This place belongs." It was not an act of exile, it was a claiming. That evening, a group of boys gathered by the central fire and began to tell stories, not serious ones, not the tales of ancestors and epic hunts, but soft, half-foolish tales of shape-shifting foxes and spirits who lost their way in the dark. Someone asked for a tale about the eagle, and there was a pause, but only a small one. Then one boy spoke, not of Erke, not of her dream directly, but of a bird who could see beyond the mountains and spoke to those with clear hearts. The story was clumsy, full of wandering paths and too many jokes, but it ended with laughter, not fear. That, too, was a shift. Later that night, as you walked to your yurt, you passed by Erke's once more. The 2 oil lamps were still there, and between them, something new. A strip of cloth, dyed a deep rust color, was tied between 2 short posts. No symbols, no writing, just a color. But you knew what it meant. Rust red was a blessing color, often used at weddings or births. It didn't promise anything, it didn't ask for permission, it simply declared, "This space holds life." You paused there for a moment, not out of pity or curiosity, but respect. Erke's story had not ended, it had not been forgotten, but it had changed. The scandal, if it had ever truly been one, had softened into something more human. A moment of fear, perhaps, or misunderstanding. Or maybe just a story that had taken time to grow into the shape it was always meant to be. As you turned toward your own fire, the wind stirred through the grass again, carrying with it a whisper of something far off. It might have been the cry of a bird, or just the creak of a distant yurt post. But in that moment, it sounded like flight. spring, though still uncertain in its footing, had begun to leave clearer signs now. Patches of grass sprouted thick around the southern side of the camp, nudging up between stones and around the roots of posts hammered into the earth months ago. The goats wandered farther each morning, their bells chiming softly through the rising mist. Even the crows, so long quiet and solitary, returned in pairs, dipping low over the tents as if inspecting the lives unfolding beneath them. Change had come, not all at once, but steadily, as if the land itself had decided it was time to begin again. On one of these brighter mornings, you found yourself carrying a bundle of wool to the outer hearths where the cloth makers worked with stiff fingers and warm breath, kneading water into fibers, smoothing loops across worn frames. Erke was there, not just nearby, but among them. She sat on a low stool, legs folded beneath her, combing through a twisted mass of pale yarn with a patience that seemed almost meditative. No one ignored her, no one gawked. She was simply there, and her presence no longer disturbed the air. That was how you knew the turning had truly taken hold. She looked different in the sunlight. Softer, maybe. Her face still carried the quiet reserve it always had, but the sharpness had dulled at the edges, like stone weathered by rain. You watched her lift a strand of tangled wool and begin to unravel it, her fingers deft, moving with the kind of skill that comes not from speed, but from understanding the material itself. It was an ordinary task, but in it you saw something deeper. A reflection, perhaps, of the way she had unraveled the tangle around her own place in the camp. Slowly, with care, and without forcing what could not yet be undone. Word came that a caravan was approaching. Traders from the river valleys known for their brightly dyed silks and deep jars of salt-pickled root. Their arrival was not unexpected. It was the time of year when the paths grew passable again, but it added a flutter to the camp's preparations. Fires were built higher, cookpots were scrubbed until they shone. Children were reminded of manners and warnings, and the elders met twice that day, sitting longer in their circle, speaking not of Erke now, but of trade and bartering, of what goods might be exchanged and which stories might best be held back. In the late afternoon, you passed by Erke's yurt and saw that the strip of rust-coloured cloth was now joined by a smaller one in a faded blue, the kind used in offerings for safe journeys. You wondered who had placed it, or if perhaps she had done so herself, quietly marking the shift from isolation to integration, from one kind of waiting to another. That evening, the sun cast long shadows across the camp. Fires glowed earlier, their light catching in the dust and smoke that danced lazily on the air. Near one of them, Erke sat with a child in her lap, not her own. She had no children of her own, but one of the neighbours, already half asleep with a smudge of ash on his cheek and a piece of dried fruit clutched in his hand. She hummed something faint and melodic, not a lullaby, not quite a prayer, just a tune worn smooth by use, the kind that kept the darkness from creeping too close. Others sat nearby, not necessarily watching her, but aware of her, accepting her as part of the fire's circle again. The child stirred once and mumbled something in his sleep, and she shifted just slightly to cradle him more fully, her hands cupping the back of his head, the way one cups a flame against the wind. And in that moment, you realized something. The scandal had never truly been the dream. It had been the fear of what the dream might mean. The fear of being wrong, of losing control. But Erke had held to her truth not with fire or challenge, but with patience, with steadiness. And now the camp too was learning how to sit with that truth, not as threat, but as thread. You returned to your own fire as the stars crept out overhead. Somewhere near the horses, a drumbeat thudded softly, marking time for a dancer practicing alone. The scent of roasted millet clung to your sleeves, and from Erke's side of camp, the oil lamps burned, one red, one blue, side by side like beacons for the quiet-hearted. They came just as the sky turned the color of soft bronze, that fleeting hour when the hills glowed as though lit from within. The caravan was not large, 7 camels, 2 wagons, a small flock of thin-legged goats trailing behind like dust shadows, but it moved with the quiet authority of those who knew their way across shifting terrain. Their leader, a broad-shouldered woman in a patchworked cloak, rode at the front without speaking, her eyes scanning the camp with the calm of someone counting not just yurts, but the stories they held. Children ran ahead to greet them, their feet kicking up the thin crust of dried mud as they scattered like birds. The traders did not slow for the children, but they did not chase them off either. A boy reached up to touch the tassel hanging from a camel's pack and was met with a wink and a toss of a dried fig. The camp stirred with energy, not frantic, but full of the kind of movement that always followed arrivals, people brushing their robes clean, uncovering wares that had been hidden away for this moment, tying hair a little tighter, and loosening voices that had grown stiff from the sameness of winter. You watched from the edge as the caravans settled. The camels knelt, their burdens groaning against leather straps. The wagons creaked as their wheels sank into softer ground, and the traders climbed down one by one, their bodies marked by wind and sun. Dust hung in the air for a moment longer before the wind swept it eastward, away from the heart of the camp. Erke stood some distance back, near the herb-drying racks, her eyes fixed not on the goods or the strangers, but on the sky above them. A crow glided there, low and slow, not circling, but following the breeze in long, lazy arcs. She didn't move, didn't call attention to herself, but you could feel her awareness, the way her gaze lingered just a heartbeat longer than the others. The caravan's leader, the woman with the patchworked cloak, made her way toward the elders. She walked with the smooth gait of someone who had walked farther than most, and had no need to prove it. Her greetings were short, but respectful. She offered gifts, small tokens of arrival, not barter. A square of southern paper, a vial of river clay, a length of thread dyed with plum bark. The elders accepted these with practiced nods, their eyes already calculating the worth and weight of what would come next. There was, however, a pause when she asked about the dreamer. Not by name, she didn't say Erke, she said only, "I was told there is one here who saw the eagle." The air changed, not tensed, no, but it grew still again, like the moment just before a bird lifts from the grass. The matron looked toward the outer circle, then back at the trader. "She is here," she said, "but we do not speak of the dream often now." The woman nodded, not in agreement, but in understanding. She did not ask again. Later, after the goods had been laid out and the bartering began in earnest, salt for wool, dried pears for iron nails, crushed beetle dye for strong leather, you saw Erke standing at a distance once more. She hadn't approached the market circle, but her presence was not questioned. She was no longer a disruption, just a part of the story, as much as the camels or the spice or the hush of wind through the tents. One of the younger traders, a boy barely older than the children who had run to meet them, wandered near her place. He carried a flute slung from a cord around his neck, its reed mouthpiece stained from long use. He didn't speak to her, but he played as he passed, a light, airy tune, playful and strange, not from your region. And she turned just slightly, listening, as the notes slipped between the yurt posts and the cooking fires. She did not smile, but her head tilted in time with the music. That night, as the fires burned lower, and the last trades were whispered between tired voices, you caught a glimpse of the caravan woman near Erke's yurt. Just a glimpse. She did not enter, but she placed something at the base of one of the support posts, a feather, pale and unmarked, bound in red thread. No words were spoken, none were needed. The lamp outside Erke's yurt flickered steadily, the blue and rust cloths now fluttering together in the rising spring wind. By the following morning, the caravan had become a natural part of the camp's rhythm, its members drifting between yurts with practiced ease, their presence no longer a novelty but a temporary extension of the community itself. Children tagged behind the traders, wide-eyed at the colors and smells of foreign spices. The scent of crushed citrus peel mingled with boiling milk and roasted millet, and the air tasted richer somehow, as if it too had travelled from the valleys beyond the hills. The wagons, once heavy with goods, stood lighter now, and their owners moved with looser shoulders, satisfied with the trades made. Erke remained a quiet observer to it all. She did not linger in the market spaces, nor did she present anything of her own to trade. Yet, when you watched her from a distance, you could see that she was listening in the way that meant she was storing not just facts, but the shape of things. The tones of the traders' voices, the way they pronounced certain names, the bits of news they let slip between stories about roads and weather. She absorbed them without claiming them, held them like water in a stone bowl, calm and clear. It was mid-afternoon when one of the traders gathered a circle of listeners near the central fire. Not the leader this time, but a younger man with a worn lute and a voice that danced easily, from solemn to playful. He told stories as he tuned the strings, tales of river spirits and mountain ghosts, of thieves turned holy men and camels that sang songs in the rain. And then, as though it had been tucked beneath his tongue all along, he began a story about a dream. This dream, he said, had crossed the steppe more times than anyone knew. It had landed in the hearts of herders and healers, of children barely weaned and elders half asleep in the sun. It always came the same way, with the cry of a bird not seen, a circle in the sky, and a silence so deep it seemed to stretch across seasons. Some said it was an omen, others said it was a map, though no one had found the place it pointed to. But all agreed on one thing: those who dreamed it could never unsee it. And they were marked not with shame, but with a task not yet fully known. No one said Erke's name, not even once, but every ear tilted toward her yurt. The fire crackled quietly as he finished, and then, with no fanfare, the trader began another tale, this one about a fox who tricked a monk into trading his boots for a melon. The laughter returned, the mood lightened, but the earlier story lingered in the air like incense that clings to wool long after the smoke has faded. That evening, you passed by Erke's fire again. She was sitting outside, carving thin strips of bark with a small knife, shaping them into curved slivers for kindling or perhaps for weaving. Her eyes were distant, but her hands moved with surety. At her feet lay the feather from the caravan leader, now tucked inside a simple reed basket beside smooth stones and bits of thread. A small collection, private and untouched by any but her. She looked up briefly as you approached, not startled, just aware. "The story's changing," she said softly. "It doesn't belong to me anymore. Maybe it never did." You sat beside her for a time, neither of you speaking. The wind had begun to pick up again, tugging lightly at the cloths tied near her door. From the main fires you could hear the thud of drum beats, slow and steady, marking the hour before sleep. the kind of rhythm that said, "Here we are, still here." In that moment, the camp felt more whole than it had in many moons. The dream had not been solved, nor fully understood, but it was no longer feared. It had passed through the hearts of many now, softened by retelling, reshaped by new hands. And in that reshaping, perhaps it had become something more useful than a warning, a reminder maybe of how stories bind people when nothing else can. The stars blinked on one by one, and from somewhere near the goat pens, a flute played that same tune again, the one that had drifted past her yurt days ago, light as thread on the wind, and the lamp outside her yurt burned steady. Night fell gently over the camp that evening, not in haste, but like a great hand pulling a soft blanket across the sky. The traders had begun retreating to their wagons, bellies full, voices low from too much tea and bargaining. Fires crackled in their low stone rings, the embers sighing with every small gust of wind. Somewhere nearby, a goat bleated in its sleep, and beyond that silence stretched wide and comforting. The kind of silence that came not from absence, but from fullness. Nothing more needed to be said. Erke had gone inside her yurt by now. The reed basket still sat by her doorway, and the feather lay at its top, catching the light from her oil lamp in a faint golden shimmer. She did not appear again that night, but her presence lingered all the same, like the hum of a song you didn't realize you'd been humming all along. You stayed near your own fire, letting the warmth reach your palms, the smell of singed herbs and damp wool drifting up to mingle with the sharp coolness of the air. Thoughts came easily in that quiet. Not urgent thoughts, but the kind that stirred gently, the kind that felt like memory and dream braided into one. You thought of when Erke's name had first been spoken in fear, when even the sound of it had drawn glances and low murmurs. And now she had become a figure not of scandal but of stillness, of patience, of something older than judgment. It was the boy with the flute who played again that night. He sat near the central hearth alone, his legs folded beneath him and the instrument resting against his chest between breaths. The song he played was different now, slower, drawn out, notes falling one at a time, like the slow drip of water into a quiet basin. It did not carry the lightness of before, nor was it heavy. It was balanced like the step of a horse walking alone down a familiar trail. Others began to drift closer, not to speak, but to listen. A mother with her babe wrapped close. A trader leaning on a staff carved with spiral patterns. Even the shaman came, standing just outside the glow of the fire, watching with eyes that missed nothing and gave away little. The music was not performed, it was offered, like a bowl of milk left outside a door. It asked nothing and expected nothing in return. And then, just as gently, it stopped. The boy lowered his flute and rested it in his lap. No one clapped. That wasn't the way of the camp, but heads bowed slightly, and people rose one by one to return to their sleeping spaces, their steps soft against the cooling earth. The stars above had sharpened, pinpricks in the black sky, steady and unswayed by all that happened below. And beneath them, the camp rested, not fully healed, not without its scars, but in rhythm again, in breathe again. Inside your yurt, as your body settled into rest, you found yourself thinking of Erke's words, that the story no longer belonged to her, that perhaps it never had. Maybe she was right. Maybe a dream was not a message but a thread. And once it had been spoken, it wove itself into the greater cloth of a people, shaped by every hand that touched it, every voice that retold it. And maybe the eagle she saw, circling silently above the world, was not meant to lead or warn. Maybe it was meant to remind that the sky was wide, and so too were the stories we carried within it. Outside, the wind changed again, blowing from the east this time, bringing with it the faintest scent of damp earth and something new. And the lamps, rust and blue, still glowed by her door, steady beacons in the stillness. By the time the first pale buds began to bloom near the river bend, the caravan had packed up and gone. Their wheels creaked one last time across the steppe, and their camels turned eastward with the same slow, purposeful rhythm they had arrived with. Farewells were simple, mostly nods and small bundles exchanged, braided rope, a wedge of salted cheese, a bright scrap of leftover silk, the kind of partings that said, "Until next time, not goodbye." After their departure, a soft quiet settled over the camp again. But it was not the heavy quiet of suspicion or silence. This quiet had space in it. It let people breathe. It let stories settle. Erke's life continued as it had been, quiet and steady, but with small shifts that were now too frequent to call accidental. She helped with the goat birthing, gently coaxing a britch kid into the world with warm hands and soft humming. She stitched 2 saddlebags for the herders heading toward the southern valley, the seams tight and clean. She even joined a small group of women one morning as they gathered reeds by the marsh for basket weaving. She spoke little, but no one asked her to. Her hands spoke well enough. It was during one of these mornings, when dew still kissed the tops of the grasses and the world held its breath in that brief hush between moonset and sun, that a new voice joined the camp. He came not from the south like the traders, but from the north. A young man, thin and wind-worn, with a horse that bore the dust of many roads. He rode in alone, carrying no banners and no baggage, save a satchel slung over one shoulder and a flute tucked into his belt. He dismounted near the elder's tent, speaking softly, offering no name of importance, but giving one nonetheless. Not many recognized it, but Erke did. She did not say so aloud. Instead, she stood just outside her yurt, watching as he was offered water and a seat. The way her hand rested lightly on the frame of her door said enough. She had heard of him, perhaps met him long ago in another camp before the dream. Or maybe his name had been one spoken softly in the days after her exile, one of the few who had not spoken against her. He did not seek her out that day, but he passed by her yurt as the sun lowered toward the hills, offering a glance, not long, not lingering, but direct. She met his eyes without shifting, and in that quiet look something passed, not forgiveness, not recognition, just a shared thread, one that needed no knots to hold. That night he played his flute. The notes were unfamiliar, neither fast nor slow, but winding like a stream twisting around stones it had known for 100 years. His song did not settle easily. It asked the listener to follow, to wander a little, to listen not just with ears, but with memory. People gathered, drawn by the strangeness of it. And when the tune ended, he said nothing. He simply nodded and walked toward the outer edge of the camp, where he set his bedroll beneath the open sky. In the dark, Erke stood again at her door, her lamp lit, its glow golden now with fresh oil. The red and blue cloths swayed gently in the breeze beside her, and above, somewhere unseen, the eagle flew again, not in warning, not in triumph, but simply because the sky was wide and still belonged to its wings. The next morning unfolded like soft cloth unwound from a spindle. The wind was warmer now, teasing the edges of blankets left out to air, shaking loose the dust that had settled over the winter. Women knelt beside wash basins, hands red with the cold of stream water, scrubbing tunics and boots. Children trailed behind, picking up stones, inventing kingdoms from branches. The goats cried hungrily, the horses stamped and tossed their heads as if impatient for longer rides. The season was changing, and with it came a restlessness, quiet but insistent. Erke began her day as she always did, with a cup of broth, a stretch beside the fire, the folding of her bedding with practiced care. But her eyes shifted often to the outer ring of the camp, to the bedroll that had remained untouched overnight, and the man who now stirred beside it. He sat cross-legged, combing the knots from his horse's mane with deliberate patience, humming to himself, his back bent in the way of someone used to being alone. She did not approach him. She didn't need to. That kind of bond, whatever it was, did not ask for immediate words. It waited, stretching across days, even years, without fraying. In some lives, silence was not absence, it was recognition. By midday, he had moved closer to the communal fires, speaking briefly with the herders, offering to help repair a bridle in exchange for cheese and firewood. He made himself useful without calling attention, which the camp always respected more than loudness. His flute, when not tucked into his belt, lay across his lap like a quiet promise. More than once, you caught someone glancing his way, curious, wondering if he was a traveler with no path or a thread returning to where it once belonged. It was the shaman who finally spoke to him. No ceremony, no symbols, just a walk through the smoke, a few words exchanged low and slow. No one heard what passed between them. But afterward, the young man bowed his head, not in submission, but as one does when acknowledging a truth already known. Later that evening, as fires burned low and the air took on that faint scent of moss and old earth, he played again. Not where everyone gathered, but nearer the edge, closer to Erke's yurt. The tune was softer this time, wrapped in long pauses, the kind of song that allowed room for breath, for reflection, for remembering. Erke did not come out, but the lamp beside her door flickered to life before the final note faded. It burned steady in the dark, casting the faintest light across the ground where the music had settled. And then, slowly, the rest of the camp began to do the same. One by one, small flames appeared at tent flaps and doorways. No signal had been given. No instruction. But something passed through the people like wind through tall grass, silent, unseen, but deeply felt. That night, you slept more deeply than usual. The ground beneath you felt warmer, the air easier in your lungs, and in your dreams there was no eagle this time, only a field, wide and green, and the sound of a flute echoing softly across the hills. The days grew longer now, stretching like lazy cats beneath the slow arc of the sun. Shadows came later and slept more lightly across the plains. With each morning, the earth seemed more awake, no longer tentative in its thaw, but boldly pushing shoots of green through cracks in the dried ground. The camp moved with a softer urgency, the kind born not from trouble but from abundance. There was more to do, yes, but it was the kind of doing that carried joy in its repetition. Erke's yurt remained at the edge, though no one thought of it as the edge anymore. It had become something else, a quiet hinge where the outside met the inside, a space people passed through rather than avoided. Her door was always half open now, her fire never too high or too low. People came and went, not in droves, but in pairs and threes, to borrow thread, to ask advice about fever, to sit and simply be in silence. And always, not far from that space, was the traveller. No one had asked him to stay, no one had urged him to leave. He remained as he had arrived, unfolding his presence like a blanket laid on the ground. He helped with small things, mended a snapped saddle strap, tuned the worn strings of a child's instrument, showed two boys how to balance baskets better, across their shoulders. His flute was heard most evenings, though he never played the same tune twice. His songs meandered like rivers, pulling you forward without urgency. It was during one of these evenings, while the camp prepared for a small feast, the first of the season's gatherings, that Erke stepped into the central fire circle once again. This time, not to speak or be summoned, but to sit. She brought with her a simple dish, millet mixed with honeyed apricots, slow-cooked over embers, and carried in a worn clay bowl. She placed it among the other offerings, nodded to no one in particular, and found her seat at the edge of the gathering. The traveller joined her there, not beside her, but a few paces off. Their presence, side by side in the same circle again, passed without tension. It was like watching the return of a familiar constellation. Not loud, not startling, just right. Children danced in the flickering light of the fires. Their laughter rose above the drumbeats and the hum of conversation. One little girl, no more than 5, tugged Erke's sleeve and placed a flower in her palm. A bent, lopsided blossom she'd likely found near the goat pens. Erke tucked it behind her ear without a word, and smiled. And for the first time in many weeks you saw her laugh, not loudly, not with abandon, but with a warmth that crept into her eyes and softened the lines near her mouth. The traveller saw it too, and though he said nothing, his next song, played on the edge of the circle, held something different, something brighter, as if the tune itself had seen her smile and wanted to hold on to it. As the feast wound down, people drifted away in pairs, wrapped in blankets or in thought. The stars above shimmered gently, unbothered by the small stories unfolding below. And somewhere between the hum of ash cooling in the fire pits and the soft tread of padded boots on grass, the camp breathed out, its long-held sigh finally released into the open night. The wind had changed again, this time brushing across the camp with the gentle scent of distant trees and damp soil, the kind of smell that makes one pause and breathe more deeply, even without meaning to. It carried the promise of rains still a few days away, and of roots stirring beneath the earth's crust. The horses grew restless with it, shifting and snorting, and the dogs lay with their noses turned toward the breeze, twitching in their dreams. Life on the steppe always listened for the seasons before they showed their full face. Erke began to walk more often now, not in long, wandering strides, but in loops that brought her from one fire to another, her steps quiet, her presence calm. She carried small bundles of herbs in her sash, not enough to declare herself a healer, not publicly, but enough to be asked now and again what to brew for a sore throat, or what to steep for calming dreams. Her knowledge, long dormant in silence, had begun to seep back into the daily flow of the camp, like water slowly rejoining a stream. The traveller followed no fixed pattern. Some days he rode out alone toward the low hills, only to return at dusk with new stories or songs he'd composed while listening to the land. Other days he spent hours with the elders, not talking, but listening, watching their hands as they played strategy games with pebbles, noting how they measured weather by the shape of bird flight. There was something about him that suggested he had known many camps, and yet never quite belonged to any. And still he and Erke never spoke for long. Their words were brief, folded gently into greetings, questions about salt or cloth, nods exchanged in passing. But their silences spoke more, and the space between them was filled not with absence, but with understanding. They moved like two stars in a sky too vast to touch, yet always circling in quiet tandem. On the third evening after the feast, a fire was lit not for food or gathering, but for story. The tradition was old, one kept for nights when the moon was low, and the spirits, it was said, wandered closer to the edges of tents and mines. The people gathered slowly, each bringing a story to trade, truths worn thin by time, legends dressed in new robes, and small memories polished to a shine by retelling. When it was her turn, Erke did not rise or clear her throat. She only leaned forward slightly and spoke. Her voice, unused to projection, did not need to be loud. The fire carried it. The stillness cradled it. She told not the story of her dream, not directly. Instead, she spoke of a river that had once changed its course in the middle of a summer so dry the fish had forgotten how to swim. Of a girl who listened to that river's whisper when no one else did, and how the elders ignored her until the river swallowed their path home. It was not a moral tale, not a warning, just a remembering. And when she finished, no one asked if it was true. The traveller played after her. Not a song of celebration or sorrow, but a melody that moved like water, echoing the rhythm of her voice, the space between her words. It did not try to explain, it only accompanied. That night, the lamps burned later than usual. A hush had fallen over the camp, not heavy, but thoughtful, the kind that made one tuck blankets higher, nestle closer to embers, and feel the breath of another story beginning to form just beneath the skin of sleep. And as the stars wheeled above, the blue and rust cloths danced lightly in the wind. By the next morning, a fine mist had crept over the steppe, not thick enough to hide anything, but enough to soften the edges of tents and people alike. The kind of mist that made the yurt cloth look heavier, the grasses glisten with invisible threads, and even the goats move with quieter hooves. The camp moved more slowly that day, not from weariness, but from the calm that often comes after a night of deep telling. As if the stories shared had drawn something loose from the hearts of the people and left a space behind that needed to settle gently. Erke rose early, her breath visible in the silver morning air, and stepped outside with a small cloth bundle in hand. She moved toward the stream that curled its way behind the low hills, the one used mostly for gathering reed grass and rinsing cooking pots too large for the yurt basins. She didn't look around to see if she was watched, though she must have known someone would notice. Not many went to the stream that early, and fewer still carried bundles when they did. You watched from afar as she knelt near the water's edge and unwrapped the cloth. Inside were 3 small stones, each painted with a different symbol, one for wind, one for stillness, and one for passage. She placed them in the water gently, letting them rest there just long enough to feel the current shift around them. Then she took them out, dried them carefully, and tucked them away again. Some sort of ritual maybe, or perhaps just a quiet act of thanks. The traveller came not long after she returned. His boots were damp, suggesting he had ridden out again at dawn and turned back once the mist rose. He didn't speak much that morning, but he sat for a long time near the main fire, watching the flames with the stillness of someone listening to what wasn't said. Later that day, a call went up for a hunt. Not a great one, not yet the kind of organized venture that required planning and drums, but a small ride for wild hares and birds, the kind meant to teach the younger riders and give the dogs a taste of spring chase. The traveller joined without hesitation. Erke did not. She remained in the camp, mending, sorting, weaving thin cords with beads carved from horn and bone. But when he returned, his share of meat was left near her fire pit, not spoken of, not claimed, just placed. And that night, the camp's breath seemed a little fuller. Not louder, not busier, but more whole. Children slept soundly, curled like kittens in shared bedding, the scent of cooked meat still clinging to their braids. The elders played their games slower, their pieces tapping softly against smoothed boards. A mother hummed to her newborn beside a lamp that burned blue and steady. And Erke, sitting near her fire with her stones now warmed by pocket and flame, turned one slowly in her hand. Wind, stillness, passage. The meanings did not need explaining. The traveller sat nearby, eyes half closed, the flute untouched that evening. Some nights required only listening. The stars were beginning to cluster again, thickening into summer shapes. And high above, one lone cry echoed out, a night bird, distant and sharp, a call that faded into the mist like a promise not quite spoken. The days rolled forward now with a kind of easy grace, and summer's breath could be felt in the longer light that lingered between dusk and sleep. Grass thickened beneath the hooves of the horses, and the streams, once sharp and restless from snowmelt, now moved with slower confidence, their waters clearer, deeper. The air smelled of warm hides and sweet flowering shrubs, and the sounds of the camp took on a new tempo, faster steps, louder laughter, and the sharp click of tools preparing for travel and gathering. Erke moved with purpose, but never haste. She wove each day into the next like strands of wool, pulled evenly from the spindle, no snags, no skipped threads. Her yurt, once marked by silence, now bore soft signs of community. A child's drawing scratched into the dust beside the doorway, a gift of dried berries tied in muslin hung on the support post. The basket that held the feather and painted stones had been joined by a folded bit of linen embroidered with a single curved line, a gift from someone who never admitted it aloud. The traveller remained too, no longer a guest, not yet fully one of the camp, but something in between. A steady presence. He took part in work when needed, and vanished when not, his flute still heard in the late hours, the notes now carrying a deeper hum, like a voice remembered rather than freshly spoken. He and Erke rarely exchanged more than a handful of words, but their movements often fell into rhythm, walking in tandem to the water, gathering herbs from the same patch of shaded ground, tending the same pot during meal preparations, without needing to plan who stirred and who salted. What had once been scandal now felt like story, and what had been story now folded itself into memory. One afternoon, as the heat of the sun bent the air in shimmering waves over the dry earth, a girl from the outer herder families approached Erke with wide eyes and cautious steps. She held a dream. Not just words, but the weight of it behind her, a mix of fear and awe, the kind only the young still admit aloud. Erke did not dismiss her. She did not lean forward eagerly either. She simply listened. The girl spoke of circles, of feathers that fell upward, of silence that filled her chest until she woke crying. No one else heard this conversation. It was not meant for public ears, but afterward the girl ran off smiling, and later that night she placed a braid of dried lavender at Erke's door. You watched it all from near your own fire, the way that stories repeated, not in exact shapes, but in echoes. How the fear that once unraveled the camp now seemed like a thread woven into its strength. Later, when the moon rose pale and fat over the eastern rise, Erke sat by her fire again, her stones warmed and resting in her lap. The traveller joined her this time, not across from her, but beside her. His hand brushed hers only slightly as he placed a flat, oval-shaped stone next to hers. No symbol on it, just the weight of it, worn smooth by time and the slow rubbing of thought. She turned toward him, her gaze soft but steady, and for the first time she spoke his name. Just a whisper. But it carried through the night air like a bell heard over a quiet field. No one else heard it. But those who passed by later said the air felt warmer near her yurt that night. And far off, just at the edge of hearing, the soft cry of a bird echoed once, then faded. The camp had changed by slow degrees, so subtle that no single day seemed different from the last. But now, as the sun hung longer in the western sky and the grasses stood knee-deep, thick with the sound of bees and the occasional rustle of fox or hare, the season had shifted fully. What had once been whispered only in private, Erke's name, her vision, her worth, was now folded easily into the common breath of the camp. She had not returned to her old place because that place no longer existed. What had been built around her was something entirely new. The girl who had dreamed, the one with the upward falling feathers and the full chest of silence, returned again the next morning. This time she brought not only her dream, but 3 friends, each with stories of half-dreams, visions, strange sounds in the dark that had since faded but still sat heavy behind the eyes. Erke listened to each one. She asked questions only when the stories slowed. She never offered answers, only possibilities. Her words were simple, always calm. "Some dreams are warnings," she said once, "but some are invitations, and some are only echoes from another." Mind? The girls left her yurt with lighter feet. Not because they understood more, but because they no longer felt alone in their confusion. The traveller remained nearby, though less visible these days. He had begun helping the herders prepare for their seasonal movement. Saddles were being mended, poles tied and wrapped for loading, goats marked with dye for easier counting. You could often find him brushing the horses or reinforcing the wagon slats, his hands calloused and steady. He rarely played his flute now, but when he did, the camp stilled without instruction, ears drawn to the sound like dry leaves pulled toward water. One evening, a quiet gathering formed. No drums, no feast, no announcements, just a slow assembling of people outside Erke's yurt. Children came first, bearing sticks for the fire, then their parents bringing bowls of rice and lentils. Elders followed, each settling slowly onto folded blankets, bones creaking like worn leather. And when the fire was built high enough to warm the faces of all, Erke stepped out. She carried nothing, wore no special robe, but something about her made the space quiet before she even spoke. She did not tell her story again. That had passed. Instead, she spoke of belonging, of how silence can be a test, and how returning can feel like walking uphill with stones in your sleeves. She did not name names nor shame anyone. Yet you could feel the entire camp listening, not just with ears, but with hearts. Her words floated like pollen, soft and slow. When she paused, the wind did too. Then she stepped aside, and the traveller stepped forward. He said only this: "Not all journeys begin with feet." And then he played. The song he chose was not one you had heard before. It was unfamiliar and strange, a mix of notes that rose and sank like a bird unsure of which way to fly. It carried sorrow, but not sadness. It carried memory, but not weight. It drifted through the camp, brushing over tents and heads and hands until it faded, soft as breath. No one clapped. That was never the way. But when the fire burned down to embers, people sat longer. Not because they were waiting, but because they were resting in the space left behind by a truth finally named. And above them all, the stars blinked slowly into view, as they had every night before. But this time they seemed just a little closer. The next morning rose in gold, not the sharp gold of high summer, nor the faint, dusted hues of spring, but a soft, even glow that filled the camp with a sense of held breath. Everything seemed quieter, yet more awake. The birds that circled over the goat pens glided without call. The dogs padded between yurts with no bark, only an occasional curious whine. Even the children, usually quick to laughter at the break of day, moved with subdued wonder, as if they too sensed the nearness of something sacred. Erke rose as she always did, but this time she did not move toward the cooking fires or the water jugs. Instead, she walked out past the edge of the camp, where the grass grew taller and the ground still held the night's chill. She paused near a stand of scrub trees alone, except for a crow perched overhead, who tilted its head to watch but did not call. There she knelt. No ceremony, no tools, just her and the earth. She dug with her hands, slowly pushing aside the grass roots and dry soil, until she uncovered a small, circular pit. Nothing grand, just a mark she had made months ago, perhaps even during the first days of her return. From within her robes, she drew out the painted stones, the 3 that had followed her from exile to welcome. One by one, she placed them back into the earth. Wind, stillness, passage, and then the 4th, the newest. The smooth, unmarked stone given by the traveller. She held it longer than the others, pressing her thumb against its cool surface before placing it gently atop the others. No words were spoken, but when she stood, the breeze picked up, as if the land had acknowledged the act in its own quiet way. Back in the camp, the traveller helped load the first of the herder wagons. It was nearly time to move to the summer grounds, not all at once, but in waves. The camp never left like a parade. It peeled away slowly, like bark from an old tree, each piece finding its own rhythm. You watched as Erke returned. Her face was calm, eyes steady. She passed by the fire circle where elders sat preparing lists of supplies and nodded toward them. They did not return the nod right away. But one of them, the oldest, later walked to her yurt and placed a bundle of dried roots at her door. A healer's gift, a quiet acknowledgement. And in the evening, as the sun folded itself behind the western ridges, the traveller sat outside his tent. He held his flute, but did not play. He was waiting. Erke came to him. She sat, not across from him this time, but beside him. Close enough that their shoulders nearly brushed, she reached out and placed a hand on his, and for a long moment they stayed like that. No words, no movement, just a pause, full and alive, and somewhere far above the eagle flew again, not circling, not hunting, just soaring in the wide blue sky that had always belonged to both of them. The night that followed passed without interruption, though no one would call it uneventful. It was one of those rare evenings where silence carries more weight than music, where the flickering of the fire and the slow breathing of the earth seemed to speak more clearly than voices ever could. The camp slept as one body, the tents spaced like ribs along a spine of lived memory. Some small sounds rose and faded, an owl shifting in the rafters, a kettle clicking softly as it cooled, the rhythmic turning of a restless sleeper adjusting to dreams. But they were all ordinary noises, the kind that mark a place as inhabited and at peace. When morning came, it arrived gently, with skies blushing in soft strokes of apricot and pearl. The grasses shimmered with a light dew that did not chill the hands, but invited touch, and the horses grazed close to the tents, not yet called to their bridles. Erke emerged just after the first kettle had begun to steam, her hands tucked into her sleeves, her steps unhurried. The traveller sat nearby, leaning against the curved side of his tent, eyes closed but not asleep. When she passed by, she touched his shoulder, not out of formality, but with that casual kind of care that grows between two people when words have long since ceased to be needed. He opened his eyes only briefly and offered her a faint, contented smile before closing them again. Throughout the camp, Preparations for movement picked up. Wool was packed, ropes coiled, dried meat stored and sealed. The air buzzed with energy, not loud or chaotic, but steady and full of shared direction. Everyone knew their role. There was no need for orders. A child ran past, carrying a leather water pouch almost as tall as herself, while her father strapped a large clay pot to the side of a cart. Mothers braided their daughters' hair tighter for the road ahead. The dogs, sensing the shift, paced more eagerly, their noses sniffing toward the horizon. Everything moved together, a gentle gathering of momentum. And yet, even in the midst of this bustle, eyes turned now and again toward Erke's yurt. No longer with suspicion, nor even with curiosity, but simply out of habit. She had become a part of the pulse of the camp, a note within its music. People no longer waited to see what she would do. They simply noted it, like one might glance at the weather before setting out, not in fear, but in rhythm. That morning she packed slowly. She placed her painted stones in a small pouch, tied the cords of her bundles twice, and paused once to smooth the blanket on her bedroll with a care that suggested not farewell, but thanks. Then she stepped out and began to assist an elder whose eyesight had faded, helping him identify which sacks held tea and which held dried roots. No one commented when the traveller brought his tent down beside hers. It was done with a quiet efficiency, and when his belongings were loaded onto his mare, a few elders glanced at one another knowingly, but said nothing. It was clear now that when the camp moved, they would move together. The afternoon passed in soft hours. The final repairs were checked, the animals fed one last time before the journey, and a few yurts were already unpinned from their moorings, their frames exposed like skeletons in the sun. Erke and the traveller walked to the far side of the hill once the chores were done. They took no tools, no packs, only themselves. You watched them go, their figures shrinking against the horizon, moving slowly as if the land had to reacquaint itself with their weight. They paused at the crest and stood there a long while, silhouetted by light that spilled behind them like an old blessing. When they returned, dusk had nearly arrived. The fires were being lit, and the last meal of the season in that place was already simmering in shared pots. Erke knelt to stoke the flames, and the traveller sat behind her, tuning his flute, not to perform, but perhaps just to feel the reed beneath his fingers one more time in stillness. He played no song that night. The music remained inside him. And yet the camp felt filled with it anyway, as though the very shape of his silence was enough to remind everyone of what had passed. Later, as the moon slipped out from behind a high sweep of clouds and cast a silver hush over the grasslands, the first cart moved, just one. A gentle start, almost ceremonial. Then another. Then the slow shuffle of hooves and the creak of leather straps joined in. Not a caravan, not yet. Just a ripple of motion, a whisper of departure. It would take days for all to leave, but the movement had begun. Erke watched, her hand resting lightly on the yoke of her cart, eyes soft, not with sorrow, but with presence. She was here now, fully. And wherever they would go next, she would go not as the one who dreamed too loudly, but as the woman who returned without asking permission and was received without needing to be. The trail ahead stretched like a ribbon sewn gently into the land, curving softly with the hills and vanishing into that place where the horizon seemed to melt into the sky. The morning of departure had arrived without fanfare, though the air had that particular stillness that comes when a place knows it's being left behind. Fires were not rekindled that morning. It was scattered with care, and even the stones used to circle the hearths were left unstacked, returned to the earth as if bowing in quiet gratitude for all the warmth they had helped hold. Hooves were checked. leather straps pulled tight, carts creaked into readiness, and still no one raised their voice. The leaving was not a tear, it was a breath. Erke stood beside her cart, adjusting the wool covers with practiced hands, tucking the feathered pouch of stones beneath the wooden seat, where it would stay close. The traveller stood beside her, not offering to lead, not asking to follow. They were not joined by marriage or name, and yet no one in the camp questioned the closeness with which they stood. Some things needed no explanation, and even fewer needed approval. They were simply what they were, like the wind or the shape of the hills. As the carts began to move in their slow and creaking rhythm, the camp left behind was soon reduced to only footprints and flattened grass. The great open steppe swallowed its memory with ease, as it had done for every camp that had ever risen and fallen, in its wide arms. Birds flew overhead, low and gliding, their shadows passing over the travellers like soft warnings or blessings. Children rode with sleepy heads resting on sacks of rice and millet, their laughter muffled by wool and wind. The dogs ran in zigzags alongside the animals, weaving between carts, tongues lolling with joy. Erke did not speak much on that first day. Her eyes traced the movement of the land, the slow shifting of the clouds, the way light pooled in the folds of the hills ahead. She had walked this land before, long ago, when her feet had not known where they led. Now she returned not as a question, but as part of the answer. Each step was no longer a search, but a continuation. At midday, when the caravan paused to let the animals drink, she walked away from the group for a moment, just beyond the last cart. She crouched low and gathered a handful of earth in her fingers, pressing it between her palms and breathing it in. It smelled of moss and dust and the faint trace of wild garlic. Then she let it fall. Behind her, the traveller sat with his legs stretched before him, watching the sky. He said nothing, just reached into his satchel and withdrew the flute again. No music came from it, he only held it, his fingers slowly turning it as though checking whether it too remembered the journey. That evening, they made camp by a shallow bend in a slow-moving stream. The kind of place chosen more for its stillness than for its utility. Fires were lit, but fewer stories were told that night. People seemed more interested in resting, in simply sitting beside the heat and letting their thoughts unwind without needing to be spoken. Children, overtired from the day's ride, leaned against one another and drifted to sleep before supper was even ladled. Elders massaged joints and murmured soft blessings to the fire. Erke did not sleep early. She remained near the stream, watching the reflection of stars dance in the ripples. The traveller joined her again, settling beside her on a smooth stone warmed by the day's heat. For a long time they said nothing. Then she whispered, not to him, not quite to herself, but to the air between them. "It's quieter now, not outside. In me." He nodded, resting his flute gently beside her pouch of stones. They sat there until the moon rose, large and full, lighting the land as if it had something kind to say. When they returned to the tent, the lamp was already lit, the same one with the red and blue cloth tied around its base. Its flame danced softly in the breeze that swept through the low grass, and the shadows it cast inside the yurt fell across two blankets laid side by side, no longer solitary, and so the night held them, not as outcasts, not as symbols, just as two people who had walked far and come through. Morning came, not with a burst, but with a slow stretching of light across the hills. The kind of light that carries no urgency, only warmth. Dew clung to the blades of grass in delicate strands. and the sound of the stream was steadier than it had been the night before, as if the water itself had exhaled after holding its breath through the long passage of silence. In the soft hush between darkness and daylight, the camp stirred gently, like a body waking after a deep, dreamless sleep. There were no raised voices, no hurrying footsteps, only the faint rustle of blankets being folded and the rhythmic brushing of wool robes against the ground. Erke stepped out of her yurt as the sky began to bloom with faint color. She stood barefoot for a moment, letting the cool grass soak into her soles. The land felt familiar now, not in a way that suggested she had mastered it, but in the way a child might recognize the voice of a parent in a crowd. It welcomed her, not with words, but with a soft invitation to belong. She bent to gather a few sprigs of wild mint growing near the stream and crushed them gently between her fingers, releasing the crisp scent into the air. Then she stepped back inside and began to prepare the morning broth, as she had done every morning since her return. There was no ceremony in her movements, only rhythm and peace. The traveler was already awake, seated on a log near the edge of camp, his eyes following the lazy path of a hawk gliding overhead. His flute rested beside him, untouched, as it had for several days now. Music, it seemed, was no longer needed to speak what had already been understood. When Erke brought him a small bowl of broth, he smiled, and together they sat beneath the half-formed sky, sipping slowly, letting the warmth settle into their bellies. They did not speak. There was nothing left that needed to be explained. Around them, the camp was coming alive in quiet ways. The younger herders were already guiding the goats toward a low pass in the hills where grazing was better. A few carts had begun rolling, the creak of their wheels blending with the calls of morning birds. Mothers strapped babies to their backs and fathers checked the leather on their saddles, nodding softly to one another in unspoken recognition that the journey still had many days ahead. But today's start was slow, deliberate. It was the kind of morning where no one needed to be told to linger. As the sun lifted higher, Erke walked once more to the stream, her pouch of stones in her hand. She crouched near the edge where the water lapped softly at the bank and unwrapped each stone with care. She held them for a moment in her palm, letting the sunlight warm their painted surfaces, before setting them down in the stream one by one. They did not sink quickly, they lingered as if remembering. Then the current pulled them slowly into motion, carrying them forward until they disappeared from sight. She kept only one stone, the smooth, unmarked one the traveler had given her. She held it tightly for a while, then slipped it into the fold of her robe, closest to her heart. It wasn't a relic. It was a reminder of stillness, of returning, of the weight we choose to carry, and the pieces we learn to let go. That evening, the camp settled in a new place, a flat patch of grass beside a bend in the river where the trees leaned in slightly as if listening. The yurts were arranged in a loose circle, with Erke's once again not at the center, but never far. Fires crackled as dusk painted the world in soft golds and blues, and the first stars began to poke through the veil of twilight. Children gathered near one of the fires, listening to an elder recite an old tale about a fox that tricked a spirit into giving up its shadow. The story was familiar, but they still laughed at the same places, gasped at the same turns. It was not the content that mattered, but the telling, and the presence of those who listened. Erke sat with the traveler near the edge of the firelight. They did not join the storytelling, they simply watched, heads close, sharing a piece of flatbread between them. And though neither of them said a word, it was clear they were no longer separate threads. They had been knotted together, not tightly, not in a way that binds, but in the kind of loop that grows stronger with time and breath and silence. And as night wrapped the camp in its cool arms, a soft wind passed over the tents, carrying with it the faint scent of mint and firewood and the memory of dreams once feared. The lamps outside Erke's yurt flickered softly in the breeze, their blue and rust cloths whispering against each other. Above, the stars blinked quietly, patient and eternal. And so ends this story, not with a lesson, not with a judgment, but with a breath held, a breath released, and sleep at last.